I am Thomas Harrison. I am 70 years old, and I am still trying to understand the depth of the wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted on me. As my wife lay dying in the hospital, our only daughter flew to Dubai, telling her husband on the phone that the old woman didn't have much time left anyway, and she didn't want to waste her time waiting around. But let me tell you, when she finally returned from her luxury trip and confidently pushed open the door to her mother's hospital room, she saw a scene that made her lose consciousness and collapse right there on the floor. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your worth. The rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound left in my world. That sharp, endless tone echoed off the sterile white walls of the intensive care unit at Chicago City General Hospital. For the past 3 weeks, this small, cold room had been my entire universe. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, my back aching with the stiff, unyielding pain that comes with being 70 years old, but I refused to move. My hands, rough and calloused from decades of working in the construction business, gently held the fragile, pale hand of my wife, Catherine. Catherine was 68 years old, but looking at her tangled in a web of transparent tubes and wires, she seemed so much smaller than the vibrant, unstoppable woman I had loved for 45 years. We had built our life from the ground up. I started as an independent contractor, pouring concrete in the biting Chicago winters, while Catherine managed our meager finances from a tiny kitchen table. Together, we turned nothing into a highly successful commercial construction firm. We gave our daughter, Melissa, everything we never had: private schools, expensive lessons, a paid-off college tuition, and the down payment for her first home. We did it all out of pure, unconditional love. But right now, all that money, all those decades of sacrifice felt completely useless. They could not buy Catherine a new heart. Her severe heart failure had progressed far beyond the reach of modern medicine. The heavy wooden door to the ICU suite clicked open, and Dr. Aris stepped inside. He had that somber, professional look on his face that doctors only wear when they have run out of miracles. He stood at the foot of Catherine's bed holding a metal clipboard to his chest and looked at me with deep sympathy. "Thomas." He began, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I am so sorry. We have exhausted every viable medical intervention. Her heart is simply too weak to pump on its own anymore. The medication is barely keeping her comfortable." I felt a cold lump form in my throat. How much time, I asked, my voice cracking in a way I could not control. Dr. Aris sighed, looking down at his clipboard before meeting my eyes again. "Days, perhaps. Honestly, Thomas, she might not make it through the weekend. You need to call your family. You need to gather everyone so they can say their goodbyes." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I nodded slowly, unable to speak, and simply squeezed Catherine's cold hand. Dr. Aris placed a comforting hand on my shoulder and quietly exited the room, leaving me alone with the woman who had been my entire world. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, powered only by the machines. I knew I had to be strong. I had to make the hardest phone call of my life. I needed to call Melissa. She was 38 now, a supposedly successful executive who always wore designer suits and spoke in corporate jargon, but to me she was still my little girl. I knew she was incredibly busy with her husband Derek, a financial advisor who always seemed a little too slick for my liking. But this was her mother. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that she would drop everything, cancel all her meetings, and rush to the hospital to hold her mother's hand one last time. I leaned over, kissed Catherine softly on her forehead, and whispered that I would be right back. I needed a moment to gather myself, to wipe the tears from my eyes so I could sound steady on the phone. I stepped out of the heavy ICU doors and into the brightly lit, sterile hallway. The smell of strong antiseptic and old coffee lingered in the air. I decided to walk down to the waiting area by the elevators to grab a cup of black coffee from the vending machine before making the call. My boots squeaked softly against the linoleum floor, as I moved down the corridor. As I approached the corner where the hallway branched off toward the elevator bank, I heard a voice. A very familiar, sharp, commanding voice. It was Melissa. My heart leapt with a sudden burst of gratitude. She was already here. She must have spoken to the nurses at the front desk. She had come on her own. I quickened my pace, ready to turn the corner and pull my daughter into my arms, ready to cry on her shoulder and tell her the devastating news about her mother. But as I reached the edge of the wall, the words I heard froze the blood in my veins. My boots stopped moving. My breath caught in my throat. Melissa was standing with her back to me, facing the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. She was dressed in an impeccable beige pantsuit, holding her designer leather tote bag, pressing her cell phone to her ear. She was not crying. She was not asking for directions to her mother's room. Her voice was steady, calculated, and terrifyingly cold. "I am telling you, Derek, there is no reason for us to change our plans," she said into the phone, her tone dripping with annoyance. "Just tell the doctors to keep the painkillers flowing. I am boarding the 9 p.m. I stood paralyzed behind the corner, my hand gripping the edge of the plaster wall so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind struggled to process the words entering my ears, "Flight tonight." What was she talking about? Melissa sighed heavily, shifting her weight onto one stiletto heel. "Listen to me, Derek. The old woman does not have much time left anyway." I spoke to the head nurse downstairs. "It is a waiting game now, and I am not going to cancel this VIP Dubai trip just to sit in a depressing hospital room watching someone breathe. The developers in Dubai need us there to finalize the penthouse details." A wave of nausea washed over me. The hallway seemed to spin. The sterile white lights buzzed above me. This could not be real. This was my daughter, the child Catherine and I had sacrificed everything for. Melissa let out a short, cynical laugh that echoed off the empty hallway walls. It was a sound I had never heard from her before, a sound completely devoid of empathy or human warmth. "Look, stop worrying about it," she continued, lowering her voice slightly, though every word still pierced my heart like a dagger. "The trust documents are ironclad. Once she flatlines, we get the life insurance payout, and Dad will be too deep in his grief to even look at the bank statements. We will have the capital to close on the Dubai property by the 15th. The inheritance money is basically ours now. Just pack your bags, Derek. I will meet you at the airport lounge." She ended the call with a sharp tap of her manicured finger against the screen. I could not breathe. My lungs felt like they had been filled with wet cement. The pain of the doctor's prognosis from 10 minutes ago was completely eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated horror of what I had just witnessed. My daughter was not here to comfort her dying mother. She was here to check on the timeline of her inheritance. She was irritated that Catherine's slow passing was inconveniencing her luxury vacation schedule. I stood there, in the quiet hallway, feeling the weight of my 70 years pressing down on my shoulders. I had spent decades building a fortress of financial security to protect my family, only to realize in one sickening moment that I had inadvertently armed the very enemy who would try to destroy us. The little girl I loved was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger who saw her mother's impending death as nothing more than a profitable real estate transaction. I did not step out from behind the corner. I did not yell. I did not confront her right then. Instead, a deep, icy calm began to spread through my chest, freezing the tears that had been in my eyes just moments before. I watched her turn and walk toward the elevator, her high heels clicking rhythmically, walking away from her mother's deathbed without a single backward glance. I took a deep breath, letting the sterile, chilled air of the hospital corridor fill my lungs. My chest was tight, completely constricted by a mixture of profound sorrow and a sudden, blinding rage. For a moment, I just stared at the back of her perfectly tailored beige suit. She was still holding the phone to her ear, probably listening to Derek confirm their flight details. I stepped out from the shadows of the corner. My heavy work boots made a distinct solid thud against the polished linoleum floor. The sound echoed down the quiet hallway, cutting through the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Melissa turned around. The moment she saw me, the annoyed, dismissive expression on her face vanished completely, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. Her eyes widened and her mouth parted slightly in shock. She quickly lowered the phone, her manicured fingers gripping the device so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of us said a word. We just stood there, separated by a few feet of empty hospital corridor, yet suddenly feeling like we were standing on opposite sides of a massive, unbridgeable chasm. "How much of that did you hear, Dad?" She finally asked, her voice trembling just a fraction of an inch. She tried to quickly compose herself, shifting her weight and lifting her chin in that corporate defensive posture she always used when she was backed into a corner. "I heard enough, Melissa," I replied. My voice was dangerously low, gravelly, with an emotion I could barely contain. "I heard you call your mother, the woman who gave you life, an old woman who does not have much time left. I heard you talking about flatlining, about life insurance, and about closing on a property in Dubai, while she lies in a bed just 50 feet away, fighting for every single breath." She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not let her. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. The anger inside me was boiling over, washing away the numbness of my grief. "How could you be so utterly heartless?" I demanded, my voice rising slightly, echoing off the bare walls. "Your mother is dying. The doctors just told me she might not survive the weekend. And you are standing out here in the hallway calculating your inheritance and planning a luxury vacation. Dad, you are taking this completely out of context." She started taking a half step back. "Derek and I have business obligations. You know how the real estate market works. If we do not close this deal, we lose millions. I do not care about your deals." I shot back, the fury radiating from my chest. "I care about the woman in that room. The woman who stayed up until 2 in the morning sewing your ballet costumes when we could barely afford groceries. The woman who worked double shifts doing bookkeeping just so we could send you to that elite private academy you begged to attend. Have you completely forgotten who built the life you are currently living?" Melissa crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive barrier against my words. "I have not forgotten anything, Dad. I know you and Mom worked hard. But I have a life too. I have responsibilities. I am a partner in a major firm now. I cannot just put everything on hold indefinitely. We have been sitting in this hospital for 3 weeks. I have clients depending on me. Responsibilities." I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Your only responsibility right now is to be a daughter. To hold your mother hand when she is terrified. To be there for her just like she was always there for you. Do you remember when you had pneumonia in middle school? She did not leave your bedside for a week. She slept in a hard plastic chair holding your hand, praying you would recover. She never once complained about her schedule or her business. You were her entire world." I watched her face, searching desperately for a flicker of shame, a hint of the loving daughter we had raised. But her expression remained hardened, guarded behind a wall of selfish entitlement. "That was different, Dad." She argued, her tone turning sharp and defensive. "I was a child. Mom is 68. She has lived a full life. You heard the doctors. There is nothing more we can do for her medically. Me sitting by her bed watching her slowly pass away is not going to change the outcome. It is only going to traumatize me and destroy my business deals." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust. It was as if I were looking at a complete stranger. The expensive clothes, the perfect hair, the cold, calculating eyes. This was not the girl who used to run out to the driveway to greet me when I came home covered in concrete dust. This was someone entirely different, someone corrupted by greed and a twisted sense of priority. "You are going to cancel that flight, Melissa," I said, my voice unwavering, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You are going to call Derek right now, and you are going to tell him the trip is off. You are going to walk back into that intensive care unit, sit down next to your mother, and you are going to stay there until the end." Melissa let out a bitter, exasperated sigh. She uncrossed her arms and looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. Dad, you are being completely unreasonable. You are emotional. You are not thinking clearly because you are grieving. I understand that. I really do. But I cannot cancel this trip. It is already paid for. The meetings are set. If I back out now, my professional reputation will be ruined. I took another step toward her, my physical presence imposing. I spent 30 years on construction sites dealing with the toughest men in the city. I knew how to stand my ground. Your professional reputation, I asked the disgust, dripping from every syllable. You are worried about your reputation while your mother is dying. Let me make this very clear for you. If you get on that plane tonight, if you choose a penthouse in Dubai over your mother's final moments, you do not need to bother coming back. The hallway went dead silent. The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I meant every single word. I had given this girl everything, but I would not allow her to treat her mother with such blatant disrespect. Not now. Not ever. You are giving me an ultimatum, she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Her eyes narrowed, flashing with a sudden, intense defiance. You are going to threaten to disown me over a business trip. It is not a business trip, Melissa, I countered. My gaze locked firmly onto hers. I heard you on the phone. Do not insult my intelligence. You called it a VIP trip. You talked about drinking and celebrating. You called her the old woman. You are ruthless. I am Thomas Harrison, 70 years old, and somehow still trying to understand the depth of the wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted on me. As a successful self-made contractor, I gave my daughter everything she ever wanted. But as my wife lay dying in the hospital, my daughter flew to Dubai, telling her husband that the old woman did not have much time left anyway, and she did not want to waste her time waiting around. When she returned from her luxury trip and pushed open the door to her mother hospital room, she saw a scene that made her completely lose consciousness and collapse. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your true worth. The rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound left in my world. That sharp, endless tone echoed off the sterile white walls of the intensive care unit at Chicago City General Hospital. For the past 3 weeks, this small, cold room had been my entire universe. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, my back aching with the stiff, unyielding pain that comes with being 70 years old. But I refused to move. My hands, rough and calloused from decades of working in the construction business, gently held the fragile, pale hand of my wife, Catherine. Catherine was 68 years old, but looking at her tangled in a web of transparent tubes and wires, she seemed so much smaller than the vibrant, unstoppable woman I had loved for 45 years. We had built our life from the ground up. I started as an independent contractor, pouring concrete in the biting Chicago winters, while Catherine managed our meager finances from a tiny kitchen table. Together, we turned nothing into a highly successful commercial construction firm. We gave our daughter, Melissa, everything we never had. Private schools, expensive lessons, a paid-off college tuition, and the down payment for her first home. We did it all out of pure, unconditional love. But right now, all that money, all those decades of sacrifice felt completely useless. They could not buy Catherine a new heart. Her severe heart failure had progressed far beyond the reach of modern medicine. The heavy wooden door to the suite clicked open, and Dr. Aris stepped inside. He had that somber, professional look on his face that doctors only wear when they have run out of miracles. He stood at the foot of Catherine's bed, holding a metal clipboard to his chest, and looked at me with deep sympathy. Thomas, he began, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I am so sorry. We have exhausted every viable medical intervention. Her heart is simply too weak to pump on its own anymore. The medication is barely keeping her comfortable. I felt a cold lump form in my throat. How much time, I asked, my voice cracking in a way I could not control. Dr. Aris sighed, looking down at his clipboard before meeting my eyes again. Days, perhaps. Honestly, Thomas, she might not make it through the weekend. You need to call your family. You need to gather everyone so they can say their goodbyes. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I nodded slowly, unable to speak, and simply squeezed Catherine's cold hand. Dr. Aris placed a comforting hand on my shoulder and quietly exited the room, leaving me alone with the woman who had been my entire world. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, powered only by the machines. I knew I had to be strong. I had to make the hardest phone call of my life. I needed to call Melissa. She was 38 now, a supposedly successful executive who always wore designer suits and spoke in corporate jargon. But to me, she was still my little girl. I knew she was incredibly busy with her husband Derek, a financial advisor who always seemed a little too slick for my liking. But this was her mother. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that she would drop everything, cancel all her meetings, and rush to the hospital to hold her mother's hand one last time. I leaned over, kissed Catherine softly on her forehead, and whispered that I would be right back. I needed a moment to gather myself, to wipe the tears from my eyes, so I could sound steady on the phone. I stepped out of the heavy doors and into the brightly lit, sterile hallway. The smell of strong antiseptic and old coffee lingered in the air. I decided to walk down to the waiting area by the elevators to grab a cup of black coffee from the vending machine before making the call. My boots squeaked softly against the linoleum floor as I moved down the corridor. As I approached the corner where the hallway branched off toward the elevator bank, I heard a voice. A very familiar, sharp, commanding voice. It was Melissa. My heart leapt with a sudden burst of gratitude. She was already here. She must have spoken to the nurses at the front desk. She had come on her own. I quickened my pace, ready to turn the corner and pull my daughter into my arms, ready to cry on her shoulder and tell her the devastating news about her mother. But as I reached the edge of the wall, the words I heard froze the blood in my veins. My boots stopped moving. My breath caught in my throat. Melissa was standing with her back to me, facing the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. She was dressed in an impeccable beige pantsuit, holding her designer leather tote bag, pressing her cell phone to her ear. She was not crying. She was not asking for directions to her mother room. Her voice was steady, calculated, and terrifyingly cold. "I am telling you, Derek, there is no reason for us to change our plans," she said into the phone, her tone dripping with annoyance. "Just tell the doctors to keep the painkillers flowing. I am boarding the 9 p.m. flight tonight." I stood paralyzed behind the corner, my hand gripping the edge of the plaster wall so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind struggled to process the words entering my ears. Flight. Tonight. What was she talking about? Melissa sighed heavily, shifting her weight. Stiletto heel. "Listen to me, Derek. The old woman does not have much time left anyway." I spoke to the head nurse downstairs. It is a waiting game now, and I am not going to cancel this VIP Dubai trip just to sit in a depressing hospital room watching someone breathe. The developers in Dubai need us there to finalize the penthouse details. The inheritance money is basically ours now. Just pack your bags, Derek. I will meet you at the airport lounge. She ended the call with a sharp tap of her finger. I stood there frozen, feeling the cold realization that the daughter I loved was truly gone forever. My entire world completely shattered into a million broken, sharp pieces. I could not breathe. Silence. She took a ragged breath, wiping a tear from her cheek. Her posture shifted from the cold, corporate executive to a crushed daughter. She looked so small, standing in the sterile corridor. "Dad, you have to understand the pressure I am under," she pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity. "You built that real estate portfolio from the ground up. You and Mom poured your blood, sweat, and tears into every building. Do you really think I would abandon her right now if it was not critical? The investors in Dubai are a massive international conglomerate, and they are notoriously impatient. If I do not show up to close this deal, they will walk away." We will lose millions. The legacy you created will be completely destabilized. I wanted to interrupt, to tell her that no amount of money mattered more than being here right now. But she stepped closer, reaching out to gently touch my forearm. Her eyes were red-rimmed and pleading. "I was in her room yesterday evening, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly on the last word. I was sitting right next to the bed, holding her hand. I was telling her how terrified I was, how I could not bear the thought of getting on a plane while she was so sick, and she squeezed my hand. I swear she squeezed my hand and opened her eyes just a fraction. It was like she was trying to tell me something without speaking. Mom wants our family financial legacy secured. She knows how hard we have worked for this buyout. I am doing this for her dad. I am doing this for both of you. The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. Mom squeezed my hand. The image she painted was so vivid, so emotional, that it struck a chord deep within my chest. My mind went back to the woman lying in the intensive care unit. Catherine was always the practical one, the financial anchor of our business. She was the one who insisted we invest our early profits into commercial properties instead of upgrading our lifestyle. It was entirely like Catherine to prioritize the family security even from her deathbed. But Catherine had also been heavily sedated for the past 3 days. The doctors said her responses were mostly involuntary reflexes. Could she really have grasped the gravity of a corporate buyout in her current condition? Could she have intentionally given Melissa her blessing to leave? I stared at my daughter, the deep lines of exhaustion on my own face, mirroring the immense fatigue weighing down my body. I was a 70-year-old man who had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping in plastic chairs, eating stale sandwiches, and watching the love of his life slowly slip away. My emotional reserves were depleted. My logical defenses were compromised by grief and severe sleep deprivation. It was easier in that moment to believe the lie. It was infinitely easier to accept that my daughter was a devoted child making a heartbreaking sacrifice for the family, rather than a cold monster fleeing her dying mother for a luxury vacation. The alternative was simply too monstrous for my fragile mind to process. A profound wave of guilt washed over me, neutralizing the burning anger I had felt just moments before. I had accused my own child of being heartless. I had assumed the absolute worst about the girl I had raised and protected. The snippet of the phone conversation I had overheard must have been just a fragment. When she called Catherine the old woman, perhaps it was a poor choice of words driven by unbearable stress. People say terrible things when they are pushed to the brink of an emotional collapse. I wanted to believe that desperately. I needed to believe it to keep my family intact as my wife faded away. I let out a long, trembling exhale, feeling the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. "I am sorry, Melissa," I said, my voice soft and raspy. "I am just so tired. The doctors gave me some very bad news today, and hearing you talk about leaving it just broke me. I should not have jumped to conclusions." Melissa nodded quickly, her face softening into a mask of pure, empathetic relief. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. "I know, Dad," she murmured into my shirt, holding me tightly. "I know you are exhausted. We are all just trying to survive this nightmare the best way we can. I love you so much. Please just promise me you will call me if anything changes. Derek and I will get on the first flight back to Chicago no matter what it costs." I hugged her back, feeling the familiar fabric of her suit against my cheek. For a brief second, it felt like the old days, holding my daughter and protecting her from the harsh realities of the world. But even in that embrace, there was a subtle disconnect. Her body felt rigid, tense, and eager to pull away. She stepped back quickly, wiping a final tear from her eye, and adjusted the strap of her designer bag over her shoulder. "Derek is waiting for me downstairs with the car," she said, checking her expensive wristwatch with a hurried glance. "I have to go now, or we will miss the international terminal check-in. Take care of Mom. I will call you the minute we land in Dubai." I watched her turn and walk rapidly down the long hallway. Her pace was brisk, purposeful, and entirely devoid of the heavy dragging steps of someone weighed down by immense sorrow. She did not look back a single time. As she rounded the corner and disappeared from my sight, the silence of the hospital corridor settled around me once again. It was a suffocating, heavy silence. The encounter had completely drained whatever small reserve of energy I had left. I stood there alone, staring at the empty space where my daughter had just been feeling a profound sense of isolation. I slowly turned around and began the heavy trudge back to the intensive care unit. My legs felt like they were made of solid lead. Every step required a conscious, deliberate effort. The bright fluorescent lights above seemed to hum with an irritating, relentless frequency. I passed the nurses' station, where two young women in blue scrubs were quietly discussing patient charts. They offered me sympathetic, polite smiles as I walked by, but I could barely muster the strength to acknowledge them. My mind was a chaotic swirl of conflicting emotions. Guilt for doubting my daughter, relief that our financial legacy was supposedly being protected, and an overwhelming, crushing sadness that I was about to face my wife's final days completely alone. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to Catherine's room. The familiar mechanical rhythm of the heart monitor greeted me instantly. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was both a comfort and a torture. It meant she was still here, but it also measured the rapidly decreasing moments we had left together right now. 2 days passed in a blur of sterile lights and hushed medical updates. I sat in that same rigid plastic chair holding Catherine's hand, watching the slow, agonizing rhythm of her breathing. Melissa had sent me a brief text message confirming her arrival in Dubai, complete with a hollow sentiment about praying for her mother. I tried to focus solely on Catherine, to push the memory of that hallway phone call out of my mind. I wanted to believe the plausible lie my daughter had spun for me. I wanted to believe she was across the world, securing a future for our family, just like Catherine would have wanted. But my gut feeling refused to be silenced. A quiet, persistent alarm rang in the back of my mind, gnawing at my conscience. The memory of Melissa, cold, calculating tone, calling her mother, the old woman replayed constantly in my head. The hospital routine was suddenly interrupted on Wednesday afternoon. Dr. Aris entered the room accompanied by an unfamiliar doctor, a renowned cardiac specialist visiting from a private institute in Boston. Dr. Aris explained that Catherine's condition had taken a highly unpredictable turn, presenting a rare complication that this visiting specialist was uniquely qualified to assess. There was a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of hope, a microscopic chance for an experimental intervention. However, because this specialist was entirely out of network and operating in a private consulting capacity, the hospital administration required an immediate upfront payment to authorize the evaluation. It was an exorbitant consulting fee, but when it comes to the woman you have loved for 45 years, money is completely irrelevant. I did not even hesitate to agree to whatever they needed to save my beloved wife. I stood up, kissed Catherine gently on the cheek, and walked out of the intensive care unit. I rode the elevator down to the main lobby, navigating the busy corridors until I found the hospital billing department. A young woman sitting behind a thick pane of glass greeted me with a polite professional smile. I explained the situation regarding the out-of-network specialist and told her I needed to process the payment right away. She typed briskly on her keyboard, brought up Catherine's file, and confirmed the substantial amount required for the immediate consultation. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my premium platinum credit card. It was a card linked directly to our primary emergency liquid fund, an account Catherine and I had spent decades building for moments exactly like this. I slid the heavy metal card under the glass partition. The young woman took it, swiped it through her terminal, and waited. A few seconds passed. She frowned, pressing a few buttons on her keyboard, and then swiped the card a second time. The polite smile on her face faltered slightly. She looked up at me with a sympathetic, apologetic expression. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of embarrassment. "I am so sorry, but the terminal is saying the card is declined. It is prompting an insufficient funds error. Would you happen to have another method of payment with you today?" I stared at her completely baffled. The words simply did not make any sense. Declined. Insufficient funds. That was mathematically impossible. I shook my head, offering her a reassuring, confident smile. There must be some sort of glitch with your machine or perhaps a security hold by the bank because of the unusual transaction amount, I explained calmly. That account holds our primary liquid assets. There is more than $500,000 sitting in there. Please try running it one more time. It has to be a simple banking error. The billing clerk nodded understandingly and manually keyed the card numbers into the system. She waited again, her eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. Once more, the machine emitted a sharp, negative beep. She shook her head, sliding the card back to me under the glass. "I am truly sorry, sir," she said, lowering her voice so the people in the waiting area would not hear. "The system is definitely declining the transaction. You might need to call your financial institution to clear up the hold." I took the card back, a strange cold sensation creeping up my spine. My hands felt unnaturally clammy. 2 months prior, when Catherine first collapsed and the reality of her severe condition became evident, I had been completely overwhelmed by grief and fear. I needed to spend every waking second at the hospital consulting with doctors, researching treatments, and sitting by her side. I did not have the mental capacity to manage our complex real estate portfolio or handle daily financial operations. In what I believed was a practical and necessary decision, I had legally granted Melissa temporary power of attorney and full management access over our emergency liquid fund. I trusted my daughter implicitly. She was a successful businesswoman perfectly capable of handling the family finances while I focused on saving my wife. I stepped away from the billing counter, finding a quiet corner in the busy hospital lobby. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the priority customer service number on the back of the platinum card. My heart was beginning to beat with a heavy, anxious rhythm. I told myself it was just a security protocol. The bank saw a massive medical charge and simply froze the account to prevent fraud. It was a routine inconvenience, nothing more. I navigated the automated menus and finally connected with a live banking representative. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison," the representative said, his voice crisp and professional. "I see you are calling about the platinum account ending in 4822. How may I assist you today?" "Yes. I am trying to pay a medical bill at Chicago City General Hospital, and the transaction is being declined," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "I assume there is a fraud alert on the card due to the large amount. Could you please lift the restriction immediately? This is a medical emergency for my wife." "I can certainly look into that for you, sir," the representative replied. "Please give me one moment while I access your account details." I stood in the corner watching doctors and nurses rush past me, my fingers drumming impatiently against my leg. The hold music played softly through the phone speaker, a cheerful, upbeat melody that felt incredibly out of place. I stared down at the polished floor tiles, willing the representative to come back on the line and fix this ridiculous error. The consultation with the visiting specialist could not be delayed. Every minute mattered for Catherine. The hold music stopped, and the representative returned. "Mr. Harrison, there are no security holds on this card," he said, his tone turning noticeably grim. "The transaction was declined due to insufficient funds." My confusion morphed into absolute dread. "That is an emergency liquid fund," I demanded. "It should have a balance of $500,000. "I am sorry, sir," he replied softly. "The current available balance is $47. The entire account was drained by Melissa Lawson 4 days ago. The entire account was drained by Melissa Lawson 4 days ago." I stood frozen in the hospital lobby. The phone was pressed against my ear, but I could no longer hear the representative. A rushing sound filled my head, drowning out the bustling noises. $500,000 was gone. I lowered the phone and ended the call with a trembling thumb. 4 days ago. That was before Catherine's condition had even deteriorated. Melissa had meticulously planned to empty our life savings long before the doctors gave us their grim prognosis. My breathing became shallow. The polished floor tiles beneath my boots seemed to tilt. I forced myself to remain standing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the impossible. Where did that much money go? Even aggressive corporate buyout negotiations did not require liquidating a family emergency fund in cash. Unless there was no buyout. Unless the entire story about international investors and saving the family legacy was a meticulously crafted lie. I needed proof. I needed to see exactly what my daughter and her husband were doing in Dubai. But I felt utterly helpless. I looked around the lobby, and my eyes landed on the main reception desk. Sitting there was a young nurse named Sarah. She had been assigned to Catherine's room during her first week and had always shown us genuine warmth. I walked slowly toward her desk. Sarah looked up from her computer monitor and offered an empathetic smile. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "how are you holding up today?" I gripped the edge of the high counter, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Not well, Sarah," I replied, my voice tight with emotion. "The doctors just told me we are out of options. I need a favor. A very unusual favor." Her smile faded into a look of genuine concern. "Of course, Mr. Harrison," she said, standing up slightly. "Whatever you need. Just tell me how I can help." "I have a son-in-law named Derek Lawson," I explained. "He and my daughter flew out last night. They told me it was a sudden business trip to Dubai to save our family company. But something feels terribly wrong. I just discovered an enormous sum of money is missing from my bank account, and I need to know what they are really doing over there." "I do not understand the internet very well," I confessed. "But Derek is always posting things on his telephone, on that application called Instagram. Is there any way you could look up his name and see if he has posted any pictures or videos from today? I just need to know if they are actually in a boardroom." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to profound sympathy. She understood exactly what I was asking her to do. She pulled out her smartphone. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, tapping the glass screen. "I can absolutely look that up for you." "What is his exact name again?" I spelled out Derek's full name for her, and she typed it into the search bar. We stood there in silence while the application loaded. "Okay, I found an account under that name," she murmured, leaning closer to me so I could see. "His profile is public, which means anyone can see what he posts. It looks like he uploaded several new updates to his story just 2 hours ago." My stomach dropped. 2 hours ago would be evening in Dubai. If they were working on a real estate acquisition, they should be exhausted sitting in a hotel room reviewing contracts. "Please play them," I said. Sarah tapped a colorful circle at the top of the screen, and a video began to play. The bright screen illuminated my face. There were no boardrooms. There were no men in business suits discussing property values. Instead, the video opened with a sweeping panoramic shot of a massive luxury yacht cruising through crystal blue ocean water. Loud, pulsating dance music blared from the phone's tiny speakers. The deck was bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. And then there he was. Derek was standing at the bow of the yacht, wearing a vibrant floral silk shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest, and expensive dark sunglasses. He was holding a massive golden bottle of champagne. The caption flashing across the bottom of the video read, "Living our best life." The camera shifted again, and my heart completely stopped. Melissa danced into the frame. She was wearing a sparkling backless designer gown, holding a crystal flute filled with the bubbling wine. She threw her head back and laughed loudly, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated joy. She twirled around, grabbing Derek by the collar and kissing his cheek while the luxury boat cut through the Persian Gulf. They were partying. They were celebrating a lavish, obscenely expensive vacation, while the woman who gave birth to her was slowly suffocating in a hospital bed 1,000 miles away. The video ended and transitioned into another clip showing a massive suite in a 5-star hotel with sweeping views of the city skyline. Derek's voice boomed from behind the camera, bragging about the private chef preparing their evening meal. The camera swung around to capture Melissa reclining on a plush velvet sofa, lifting her champagne glass toward the lens with a lazy, intoxicated smile. She looked entirely untroubled, perfectly relaxed, and absolutely isolated from the nightmare unfolding back home in Chicago. I stood completely still, unable to look away from the tiny glowing screen. My breath hitched in my throat. Every fiber of my being burned with an intense, searing combination of grief and raw betrayal. I had spent the last 48 hours agonizing over my daughter, feeling immense guilt for doubting her, tearing myself apart, because I thought she was sacrificing her emotional well-being to secure our family legacy. But she had fabricated the entire story. The pressing international investment meeting, the desperate desire to fulfill her mother dying. Wish all of it was a grotesque theatrical performance designed solely to cover up a joyride funded by stolen money. My daughter was a monster. Sarah quietly stopped the video and locked her phone. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and deep sorrow. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am so terribly sorry. I did not want her pity. I could not let anyone watch an old man break down crying in the middle of the public hospital lobby." I slowly raised my hand, signaling her to stop. "It is all right, Sarah," I replied. "Thank you for showing me this." I turned away from the reception desk. I paced aimlessly down a quiet, intersecting corridor, my boots striking the linoleum floor with a heavy, measured rhythm. My mind was no longer a chaotic mess of grief and confusion. The crushing weight of the betrayal had paradoxically crystallized my thoughts, bringing everything into sharp, terrifying focus. My daughter had abandoned her mother's stolen $500,000 and lied directly to my face without a single shred of remorse. The tears that had been threatening to fall completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. I knew I could not simply call her and demand answers. I had to treat my own daughter like a hostile adversary in a corporate takeover. I pulled out my cell phone. Sorrow had passed. It was time to go to war. After slowly leaving the billing area and pacing, I walked back toward the intensive care unit. With a heavy rhythmic step, my mind completely devoid of the suffocating grief that had paralyzed me for the past 3 weeks. The sorrow had been entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Every detail of the hospital corridor seemed magnified. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded louder. The smell of bleach felt sharper in my lungs. My daughter had not only lied to my face, but she had stolen our life savings to fund a lavish vacation while her mother lay dying. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was staggering, but I could not allow myself to be consumed by blind anger. I needed to return to Catherine's side and protect her. As I pushed through the double doors of the intensive care ward, I took a deep breath, preparing to sit back down in that uncomfortable plastic chair and figure out my next move. But before I could even reach the door to Catherine's room, I was intercepted. The head nurse, a stern but compassionate woman named Susan, stepped into my path. She was clutching a thick manila medical file tightly against her chest, and her expression was visibly strained. Over the past 3 weeks, Susan and I had developed a quiet, mutual respect. She had seen me sitting by my wife's side day and night, and she had always been completely transparent with me about Catherine's condition. But right now, she looked incredibly uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes directly. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice unusually hesitant, a stark contrast to her usual confident demeanor. "Do you have a moment to step into the private consultation room? We need to go over the new directives regarding your wife's care." I stopped in my tracks, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "New directives," I repeated, shaking my head slightly. "I am not sure what you mean, Susan. Dr. Aris and I spoke just an hour ago. He told me the situation was dire, but we did not make any new decisions about her care plan." I was just about to go back inside and sit with her. Susan shifted her weight, looking nervously down at the file in her hands. "Yes, I know you spoke with Dr. Aris earlier today," she said, her tone carrying a heavy, sympathetic weight. but I am referring to the legally binding paperwork that your daughter submitted to the hospital administration desk just a few hours ago, right before she left for the airport. The cold, creeping sensation that had started in the billing department suddenly rushed back, enveloping my entire body. My stomach plummeted. Paperwork. I asked, my voice barely a hollow whisper. What kind of paperwork did Melissa submit? Susan gently guided me by the elbow into a small, quiet family consultation room just across the hall. She closed the door behind us, shutting out the beeping monitors and the low chatter of the nurses' station. She placed the manila folder on the small round table between us and opened it. Inside was a freshly printed, legally notarized document. It is a newly drafted medical power of attorney, Susan explained gently, pointing to the bold black letters at the top of the page. Your daughter, Melissa Lawson, filed this with our legal department exactly 3 hours ago. According to this document, she has assumed full medical proxy over her mother's care. I stared at the paper, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. My mind raced back to 2 months ago when Catherine first collapsed. In my state of absolute panic and overwhelming despair, I had signed a stack of documents Melissa had pushed in front of me, believing I was simply authorizing her to handle the banking and pay the mounting medical bills so I could remain by Catherine's side without distraction. I had inadvertently handed her complete legal control over everything. I looked up at Susan, my vision blurring slightly at the edges. Okay, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. She has medical power of attorney. What does this new directive actually say? Susan took a deep, shaky breath, clearly agonizing over the words she had to deliver. Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice dropping to a somber whisper. Melissa has officially instructed the hospital to issue a do not resuscitate order for Catherine. Furthermore, she has exercised her legal authority to request the immediate withdrawal of all life-sustaining measures, including the intravenous medications that are currently stabilizing her heart rate. She stated in her filing that she wishes for her mother to be allowed to pass away peacefully, and that prolonging her life artificially goes against Catherine's wishes. The words hit me with the force of a freight train. The air was violently knocked from my lungs. A do not resuscitate order. Withdrawing life support immediately. My knees buckled slightly, and I heavily sank into the chair behind me, gripping the edges of the table to keep from collapsing completely. Melissa was not just stealing our money to fund a luxury vacation in Dubai. She was actively, deliberately orchestrating her own mother's death. The sheer, unadulterated evil of her actions echoed in the silent consultation room. I stared blindly at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Melissa's neat, looping handwriting signed with absolute precision. She had marched into this hospital, put on a theatrical display of grief for the staff, and then coldly walked to the administration office to sign her mother's death warrant. She wanted Catherine dead, and she wanted it to happen quickly, conveniently timed, while she was halfway across the world, sipping expensive champagne on a yacht. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind, forming a picture so grotesque it defied human comprehension. She needed her mother to die to access something else, something far larger than the emergency fund she had already drained. This realization was a chilling awakening, a horrifying epiphany that illuminated the absolute depths of her unforgivable treachery and her boundless sociopathic greed. Susan gently placed her hand over mine. Her eyes filled with unspeakable sorrow. I am so sorry, Thomas, she whispered softly. Our legal department is currently reviewing the document, but because it is fully notarized and bears your previous authorization granting her power of attorney, their hands are tied. They are scheduled to execute the withdrawal of life support protocols in less than 2 hours. 2 hours. My own flesh and blood had given her mother 2 hours to live. The crushing grief that had held me hostage for weeks instantly evaporated, entirely consumed by an inferno of protective, calculated rage. I looked at the nurse, the fog of despair lifting completely from my mind. I was no longer a broken, grieving husband, sitting idly by as tragedy struck. I was a man who had built an empire, a man who knew how to fight, and I was going to war. I took a deep, steadying breath. "Thank you, Susan," I said firmly, standing up from the chair. "I will not let this happen. I will stop her." I took a deep, steadying breath. "Thank you, Susan," I said firmly, standing up from the chair. "I will not let this happen. I will stop her." I walked out of that small consultation room and felt a profound, almost physical transformation taking place inside my mind. For the past 3 weeks, I had been nothing but a terrified, grieving husband, paralyzed by the fear of losing my wife. I had allowed my emotions to dictate my every move, making me vulnerable, trusting, and ultimately blind to the predator operating right under my nose. But that broken, defeated old man was gone. In his place was the man who had built a commercial construction empire from a single rusty cement mixer. The man who had negotiated with ruthless developers, crushed hostile corporate takeovers, and protected his company against every threat imaginable. My daughter had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because I was old and mourning, I was weak. She forgot who raised her. She forgot exactly who she was dealing with. I was not going to call her. I was not going to scream into the telephone and demand answers. That would only give her the opportunity to cover her tracks, move the rest of the money, and prepare a legal defense. I needed to move silently and strike with absolute precision. I turned back to Susan, who was still standing by the table looking at me with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Susan, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now," I instructed, keeping my voice low and authoritative. "Melissa may have filed that power of attorney, but I am still Catherine's legal spouse. We have been married for 45 years. I have never under any circumstances signed away my spousal rights, and I am officially countermanding that document right here and right now. I want that do not resuscitate order shredded immediately. My wife is going to receive every ounce of medical care this hospital can provide." Susan nodded quickly, a fierce determination replacing her previous hesitation. "I will contact the legal department right away, Mr. Harrison. Spousal rights supersede a secondary proxy, especially if you are physically present and contesting it. But we will need your lawyer to officially invalidate the paperwork she filed, just to ensure she cannot try to enforce it from abroad." I thanked her and stepped out into the bustling hallway. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. Benjamin Hayes had been my corporate attorney for over 30 years. He had drawn up the contracts for my very first building project, and he knew my family dynamics intimately. He answered on the second ring. "Benjamin," I said, skipping any polite greetings. "I need you at Chicago City General Hospital right now. Drop whatever you are doing and get down here. My daughter has gone rogue. She drained our primary emergency fund, and she just attempted to put a lethal medical directive on Catherine to expedite her inheritance." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Benjamin was a consummate professional, but even he was shocked. "I am on my way, Thomas," he replied instantly, his voice shifting into a crisp, tactical tone. "I will be there in 20 minutes. Do not sign anything, and do not communicate with Melissa until I arrive." I ended the call and walked back into the intensive care unit. I pulled up a chair next to Catherine's bed, but this time I did not sit slumped in defeat. I sat tall, my mind calculating every necessary step. Within half an hour, Benjamin walked through the sliding glass doors. He was a tall, imposing man in a sharp charcoal suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. He took one look at me and knew we were in a crisis. We stepped back into the quiet hospital hallway, and I briefed him on everything. The overheard phone call, the drained bank account, the yacht video in Dubai, and the horrific attempt to pull the plug on Catherine to secure a penthouse purchase. Benjamin's face hardened into a mask of pure professional outrage. He immediately pulled out his legal pad. "First things first," Benjamin said, his pen flying across the paper. "I am drafting a revocation of her power of attorney. You will sign it right now, and I will personally hand it to the hospital administration. That will kill her medical directive permanently. Next, we are going to throw a massive financial net over your entire estate. I am going to contact your banks and investment brokers to freeze every single account, trust, and asset portfolio that bears your name or Catherine's name. Melissa will not be able to move another dime without a court order. Do it, I commanded. Freeze it all. Cut off her access completely, while Benjamin went to work securing the financial perimeter. I requested an immediate meeting with Dr. Aris and the visiting cardiac specialist from Boston. We gathered in the same consultation room where I had just discovered Melissa's betrayal. The Boston specialist, a brilliant man named Dr. Evans, outlined a radical experimental surgical procedure. He explained that it involved implanting a state-of-the-art ventricular assist device that could potentially bypass the failing sections of Catherine's heart. It was incredibly high risk, and the recovery would be grueling. Furthermore, because it was an experimental trial not covered by our insurance, the out-of-pocket cost would be astronomical, easily pushing past $1 million. Dr. Evans looked at me with a serious, unwavering gaze, clearly wanting to ensure I understood the immense financial and emotional burden of this decision. He told me that many families walk away at this point because the price tag is simply too ruinous. I did not blink. I stared right back at him and told him that my money meant absolutely nothing to me if I could not use it to save my wife. I instructed him to prepare the operating room immediately. I promised to wire the initial deposit to his private medical institute the moment Benjamin unfroze my secondary corporate accounts. Dr. Evans nodded, clearly impressed by my resolve, and quickly left to begin the intensive surgical preparations. I returned to Catherine's bedside, feeling a renewed sense of purpose coursing through my veins. The steady, rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor no longer sounded like a tragic countdown to her death. It sounded like a battle drum. I leaned over the cold metal railing of her hospital bed and gently brushed a stray lock of gray hair away from her extremely pale forehead. I whispered to her that unparalleled help was finally on the way, that she was going to get the best medical care in the world, and that she just needed to hold on just a little bit longer. I promised her that I was going to completely fix the unimaginable mess our treacherous daughter had created for us. I stood up slowly, squared my tired shoulders, and watched the nurses rush in to prep her for the complex, life-saving surgery. The flurry of medical activity was a chaotic symphony of monitors and urgent voices. They unhooked Catherine from the stationary machines and seamlessly transferred her lines to portable units. Within minutes, they wheeled her out of the intensive care room, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them. I was left entirely alone in the sudden, deafening silence of the empty medical suite. The faint scent of her lavender lotion lingered in the sterile air, a ghostly reminder of the woman I was fighting to save. My transition from a paralyzed, grieving husband to a sharp, tactical businessman was now absolute. I had a perimeter to secure, but a defensive strategy was not enough. I needed an offensive weapon. I needed a professional who could operate in the shadows, someone who could bypass the polished lies and unearth the raw, ugly truth. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and scrolled past Benjamin Hayes' contact information. I kept scrolling until I found a name I had not called in over 10 years. Mike Rossi. Mike was a former federal financial investigator who had transitioned into the lucrative world of private corporate intelligence. He was a ghost in the digital realm, a man who possessed a terrifying talent for tracking hidden assets, exposing offshore accounts, and dismantling fraudulent corporate structures. I had hired him a decade ago to investigate a shady subcontractor, and he had delivered a dossier so thorough it practically guaranteed a federal indictment. He was ruthless, efficient, and entirely devoid of moral hesitation when it came to his targets. He was exactly the kind of operative I needed to dismantle my daughter. Pristine, carefully curated facade. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. Mike answered on the third ring, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like crushed rocks. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I explained the situation with total clinical detachment, detailing the missing $500,000, the revoked power of attorney, the sudden flight to Dubai, and the incriminating Instagram video the young nurse had shown me. I instructed Mike to trace every single cent of that $500,000 emergency fund. I wanted to know the exact routing numbers, the shell companies, and the specific daily expenditures occurring in the United Arab Emirates. If Melissa and Derek bought a bottle of vintage champagne, I wanted the receipt. If they chartered a luxury yacht, I wanted the rental agreement. If they booked a penthouse suite, I wanted the reservation details down to the room service charges. Then I turned my tactical focus to my son-in-law. Derek was a supposed financial advisor, a man who built his entire reputation on managing other people's wealth. He wore tailored Italian suits, drove a leased European sports car, and spoke in condescending corporate buzzwords. But men who willingly steal from their dying mother-in-law are usually desperate, hiding massive financial failures behind a thin veneer of success. I told Mike to dig deeply into Derek Advisory Firm. I wanted to see his client retention lists, his genuine performance records, and his personal debt obligations. I wanted Mike to tear up the floorboards of Derek professional life and find the rotting termite-infested wood underneath. I demanded a watertight, indisputable dossier of their crimes, a mountain of evidence so solid that no amount of smooth talking could ever dismantle it. Mike accepted the contract without a single moment of hesitation, promising a preliminary brief within 24 hours. I ended the call and began the long, slow walk toward the surgical waiting lounge. The hospital corridors felt infinitely longer now, every step heavy with the profound burden of what I had just initiated. I was actively funding a private espionage campaign against my own flesh and blood. I found a secluded corner in the surgical waiting area, a room bathed in the harsh, unflattering glow of fluorescent ceiling lights. Families sat in quiet, nervous clusters, murmuring anxious prayers and holding each other hands for comfort. I sat entirely alone, staring blankly at a faded landscape painting on the opposite wall. The tension building in my chest was a living, breathing entity coiling tightly around my ribcage. I was preparing to go to full-scale war against the child I had raised, and the emotional toll was a heavy, suffocating blanket. My mind drifted back through the decades, searching for the exact moment we had lost her. I thought about the day Melissa was born. I remembered holding her tiny, fragile body in my large, calloused hands, silently promising to protect her from every danger in this dark world. Catherine and I had given her absolutely everything. We paid exorbitant tuition for elite private schools, fully funded her expensive university degree, and provided the substantial capital for her first luxury home. We had shielded her from the brutal, grinding realities of the business world, wanting her life to be softer and easier than ours had been. But in our desperate desire to protect her, we had inadvertently cultivated a monster. We had raised a woman who viewed our deep parental love as a pathetic weakness and our hard-earned life savings as her personal inheritance payable immediately upon demand. The contrast between our reality and her reality was physically nauseating. Right now, on a brightly lit surgical table a few floors above me, my beloved wife was having her chest opened by a team of specialists. Catherine was fighting a brutal, terrifying medical battle for a tiny chance at a few more years of life. She was enduring unimaginable physical trauma just to stay by my side. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, the daughter she had loved so fiercely was likely waking up in a plush hotel bed, preparing for another day of extravagant sun-soaked indulgence funded entirely by the very money meant to save her mother life. The sheer grotesque injustice of it burned in my chest like a hot coal. It fueled the cold, calculated anger that was rapidly replacing the very last remnants of my paternal affection. I knew exactly what Mike Rossi would find. I could feel it deep within my gut. He would find a sprawling trail of deceit that extended far beyond a single stolen emergency fund. He would uncover years of financial manipulation, hidden debts, and profound sociopathic selfishness. I needed that dossier to be absolutely bulletproof. When the ultimate time came to confront them, I would not rely on emotional appeals, tearful accusations, or disappointed parental lectures. I would present a towering mountain of hard, verifiable, legally binding evidence. I would dismantle their pathetic lies with forensic precision. They would have absolutely no room to maneuver, no space to spin another fabricated story about international investors, corporate buyouts, and protecting family legacies. I would corner them with the undeniable truth of their own malicious greed. I would wait patiently in the shadows, holding my breath until the perfect moment to strike and win. I remained in the surgical waiting lounge, letting the profound silence wash over me, the adrenaline fueling my rapid response to Melissa's treacherous medical directive was settling into a cold, hard resolve. Mike Rossi was already deploying his forensic tools across international networks. Benjamin Hayes was systematically locking down the financial infrastructure of my estate. The defensive walls were built. However, a critical vulnerability remained. Time. Both Benjamin and Mike needed a minimum of 24 hours to execute their tasks without triggering alarms. If Melissa or Derek casually logged into their mobile banking applications while lounging on their yacht and discovered their access had been revoked, they would instantly know their deception was compromised. Panic would set in. Derek would immediately recognize the legal implications. He would execute rapid countermeasures, transferring whatever cash they had stolen into untraceable offshore shell corporations before Mike could establish the paper trail. I could not allow them to be spooked. I needed to ensure my daughter and her husband remained utterly confident in their grotesque victory. I had to lull them into a deep, false sense of absolute security. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and stared at the dark screen. The mere thought of communicating with her made my stomach churn. Every paternal instinct I had nurtured for decades had been eradicated, replaced by the clinical detachment of a tactician preparing an ambush. I unlocked the screen and opened the text messaging application. I scrolled down to Melissa's name. I took a deep breath and began to type out the most difficult lie I had ever constructed. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. I had to strike the exact tone of a broken, oblivious, and grieving old man. I had to portray the exact version of Thomas Harrison that she so foolishly believed me to be. The man she thought was too overwhelmed by sorrow to notice $500,000 vanishing into thin air. I slowly typed the words carefully, weighing every single syllable. Take your time with the investors, sweetheart. The word sweetheart felt like chewing on broken glass, but it was a necessary component of the camouflage. I continued typing, forcing myself to embrace the pathetic persona. Your mother is fading fast. I am too overwhelmed to even look at emails or bank accounts right now. I am just praying beside her. I read the message back to myself 3 times. It was the perfect bait. It provided her with exactly the narrative she desired. It gave her explicit permission to extend her luxurious vacation under the guise of prolonged business negotiations. More importantly, it directly assured her that the family finances were completely unmonitored. I was essentially hanging a massive neon sign that read, "I am not looking at the money." I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth and pressed send. The small blue speech bubble appeared on the screen, indicating the message was in transit across the world. I watched the delivery status change to delivered, and then almost immediately to read. It was early evening in Dubai. They were likely sitting in a 5-star restaurant or relaxing in their penthouse suite. I pictured Derek looking over Melissa's shoulder reading the message. I imagined the smug, victorious smiles spreading across their faces. Now the agonizing wait began. Would she sense the trap? Would she suspect that her carefully constructed facade was cracking? I sat perfectly still, watching the 3 small animated dots appear at the bottom of the screen, indicating that she was typing a response. The dots vanished, then reappeared. She was taking her time crafting her own reciprocal lie. Finally, my phone buzzed with an incoming text notification. I opened the message and read her response. "Oh, Dad, I am so incredibly sorry. Derek and I are absolutely devastated to hear that she is getting worse. We are pushing the investors as hard as we can, but these international deals are incredibly complex. Please do not worry about a single thing regarding the family business or the finances. I have everything handled on my end. You just focus on Mom and take care of your own health. We are praying so hard for a miracle. I love you both so much. The sheer magnitude of her sociopathic deceit was breathtaking. She was sending me thoughts and prayers while simultaneously waiting for the hospital to call and confirm that the life support machines had been successfully disconnected. She was promising to handle the family finances while she actively laundered stolen money through international accounts. She had swallowed the bait completely hook, line, and sinker. She genuinely believed she had outsmarted me. She believed her mother was hours away from passing, and that her father was too blinded by grief to notice her monumental theft. The trap had snapped shut, and she was sitting comfortably inside it, completely oblivious to the steel jaws surrounding her. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. A dark, chilling satisfaction bloomed in the center of my chest. I did not reply to her message. Total silence from my end would only reinforce the illusion that I was paralyzed by my impending loss. Let her celebrate. Let her drink the $5,000 champagne and dance on the decks of luxury yachts. Every single moment of their extravagant vacation was now a vital piece of evidence being cataloged by Mike Rossi. I leaned back against the hard plastic chair and closed my eyes, letting the quiet hum of the hospital waiting room wash over me. The battle lines were now drawn. Melissa thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess against an unarmed opponent. She had no idea that the board had already been flipped and that every move she made from this point forward was being dictated entirely by my strategy. The do not resuscitate order had been legally obliterated. Her access to the remaining family wealth had been completely severed, and soon her entire financial and personal life would be dissected by a ruthless investigator who specialized in destroying people just like her and Derek. I sat there for what felt like hours, holding on to that cold, comforting resolve. The surgical procedure to install the ventricular assist device in Catherine's heart was incredibly complex, and the wait was agonizing. But I was no longer afraid. I had secured the perimeter. I had protected my wife from the absolute worst threat imaginable, our own daughter. The future was still uncertain, and Catherine's survival was not guaranteed. But I knew one thing with certainty. When Melissa Lawson finally returned from her luxurious Middle Eastern getaway, expecting to step into an enormous inheritance and a vulnerable father, she was going to walk directly into an absolute nightmare. I would have the forensic accounting reports. I would have the video evidence. I would have the full legal backing of Benjamin Hayes. I would be waiting for her not with open arms and tears of sorrow, but with the cold, unforgiving hammer of absolute justice. I opened my eyes and looked down the long, sterile corridor toward the surgical wing. I was finally completely ready now. The next 7 days moved with an agonizingly slow and heavy rhythm. Catherine survived the initial installation of the ventricular assist device, but her condition remained critically fragile. I practically lived in the sterile confines of the surgical recovery ward, sleeping in a reclining chair and watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Every day, right on schedule, my phone would buzz with a new text message from Melissa. She continued her grotesque charade, sending me detailed, fabricated accounts of exhausting boardroom negotiations, stubborn international investors, and the immense pressure she and Derek were supposedly enduring to secure our family legacy. I responded to each message with the exact same carefully crafted tone of a broken, helpless old man. I thanked her for her incredible dedication, told her to take all the time she needed, and assured her that I was simply praying by the bedside of her mother, entirely disconnected from the outside world. I did not mention the $500,000. I did not mention the revoked power of attorney. I gave them a week to dig their own graves as deeply as humanly possible, and they happily grabbed the shovels. On the morning of the 8th day, Benjamin Hayes sent me a brief encrypted text message indicating that he and Mike Rossi had arrived at the hospital. I gave Catherine a soft kiss on her forehead, promising I would return shortly, and made my way down to the secluded executive conference room on the administrative floor. Benjamin had reserved the space specifically for our privacy. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany door, both men were already waiting. Benjamin looked characteristically severe, his tailored suit immaculate, but his face drawn with tension. Mike Rossi sat beside him wearing a dark leather jacket and a grim, completely unreadable expression. He looked like a man who spent his life wading through the absolute worst parts of human nature. Lying in the dead center of the polished conference table was a massive, thick binder overflowing with indexed tabs and printed financial records. It looked like a brick of solid evidence. I slowly pulled out a chair and sat down across from them, feeling the heavy silence in the room press against my chest. "Let us not waste any time," I said firmly, keeping my voice low and steady. "Tell me exactly what you found. Tell me everything." Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and rested a hand on the thick binder. "Thomas," he began, his gravelly voice echoing in the quiet room. "You hired me to trace the missing $500,000 from your emergency liquid fund. That part was relatively easy. Derek is incredibly sloppy for someone who calls himself a financial advisor. He funneled the cash through a hastily constructed domestic shell account before routing it directly into a private international travel fund. I have 30 pages of receipts right here. In the past 7 days, your daughter and her husband have spent over $80,000. They have chartered a private luxury yacht, booked a presidential suite at a 5-star resort in Dubai, and purchased highly exclusive designer jewelry. There are no investors. There are no corporate buyout negotiations. They are simply burning through your life savings on a massive, unhinged spending spree." I nodded slowly, staring at the closed binder. I had already known this in my gut, but hearing a professional investigator confirm the grotesque details still sent a shockwave of cold anger through my system. "But they only took $500,000, I stated, gripping the armrests of my chair. "That is a lot of money, but it is not enough to sustain them forever. Why go to such elaborate lengths, including trying to murder her mother with a medical directive just for that specific amount?" Benjamin sighed heavily and exchanged a dark, troubled look with Mike. He reached out and placed his hand flat on top of the dossier. Thomas, Benjamin said, his voice dropping an octave thick with professional dread. "The $500,000 from your emergency fund was not their ultimate goal. It was merely the operational capital they needed to fund their escape while they executed the real theft. The truth is significantly worse than we initially suspected. We have spent the last week pulling deeds, title histories, and institutional credit reports. Your daughter and Derek did not just drain your liquid assets. They went after the family estate." I frowned, my mind struggling to process his words. "The family estate," I repeated, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "You mean the commercial properties and our primary residence? But they cannot touch those. Catherine and I own those properties outright. There are no mortgages and the titles are locked in a secure family trust. How could they possibly go after the estate?" Benjamin opened the binder and flipped past the initial tabs, stopping at a section marked with a bright red flag. He turned the folder around and slid it across the polished table toward me. He pointed to a densely worded legal contract stamped with official bank insignias and notary seals. "They bypassed the trust entirely," Benjamin explained, his tone laced with absolute disgust. 2 weeks ago, shortly after you granted Melissa that temporary power of attorney for medical and banking management, Derek used his connections in the unregulated private lending sector. He approached a highly aggressive predatory lending firm. They took out a massive high-interest commercial loan against the total appraised value of your $3 million family estate. I stared blindly at the document. My name was at the bottom of the page. Beside it was the name of Catherine. Both signatures were executed in dark blue ink. "But I did not sign this," I whispered, a sickening wave of horror crashing over me. "I have never seen this document in my life." and Catherine was already unconscious in the intensive care unit on the date this was supposedly executed. Neither of us signed this. That is exactly the point, Mike Rossi interjected smoothly, leaning back in his chair. They forged your signatures. Melissa perfectly replicated your handwriting, and Derek used a corrupt notary public from his own advisory firm to officially certify the documents. Because Melissa possessed a legitimate power of attorney for your banking, the predatory lenders did not ask any complicated questions. They processed the loan based on the fraudulent collateral. They effectively mortgaged your entire $3 million legacy out from under you while you were sitting in the hospital waiting room crying over your dying wife. The money, I stammered, my chest tightening with a profound, terrifying anger. Where did the $3 million go? Benjamin pointed to another highlighted page within the binder. Derek immediately funneled the entire lump sum through a complex labyrinth of untraceable corporate shell companies. He wired the capital into offshore accounts completely outside of our domestic legal jurisdiction. He completely liquidated your entire life work. The magnitude of the crime was almost incomprehensible. Melissa tried to euthanize Catherine, not just to steal an inheritance, but to rapidly initiate the probate process before the fraudulent loans could ever be discovered. Benjamin reached into the stack of documents again, his movements precise and deliberate. He pulled out a single laminated page, a brochure for a facility called Sunny Haven Assisted Living. The name sounded pleasant enough, but the photograph underneath told a different story. It was a crumbling concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence with barred windows and overgrown dead landscaping. Benjamin slid it across the table alongside a secondary legal document. He explained that this was not merely a hypothetical scenario. Melissa had already secured a bed for me at this specific facility. The contract was signed and dated for the day after the funeral service she had already meticulously planned in her head. She had effectively written my death warrant in the form of a permanent social exile. She had told the facility administrators that my grief over Catherine's death had caused a total cognitive collapse. They were fully prepared to receive me as a ward of the state, with no access to my finances and no ability to leave. I looked at the image of that gray, decaying building and felt the blood drain from my face. My daughter had not only stolen our money and attempted to kill her own mother, but she had also plotted to lock me away in a state-funded prison for the elderly. She wanted me to wither away in that squalor while she sold our family home and cashed out the final remaining assets of our life work. She wanted to erase me from existence. She wanted to move on as if I had never been the man who built her life from the ground up. The sheer cruelty of the plan was staggering. It revealed a level of calculated malice that I could not have even imagined a human being was capable of possessing. My hands were balled into tight fists on the table. My knuckles turned white with the pressure. I was breathing deeply, trying to maintain my composure, while my entire world was being dismantled by the one person I had spent my life protecting. Mike Rossi watched me intently, his eyes like laser beams analyzing my reaction. He had clearly been around enough betrayal to recognize when someone was truly pushed to the brink. "Thomas," he said, his voice cutting through the thick tension in the room. "This is not just a simple case of theft. This is a systematic, cold-blooded dismantling of your entire life. They have spent months preparing this exit strategy. They have built an entire architecture of deception around you. They counted on your grief to keep you distracted. They knew you would be too devastated by Catherine's illness to verify the signatures or check the status of your estate. They were counting on you to be the victim who never looked back. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot that you are a builder. They forgot that you know how to read blueprints, and they definitely forgot that you know how to reinforce a foundation before the structure collapses." Benjamin added his own assessment, his voice echoing with the gravity of the situation. "We are looking at multiple felony charges here, Thomas. Forgery, fraud, financial elder abuse, conspiracy to commit theft. And if we can link the medical directive to the financial windfall, as we suspect we can, then we are looking at attempted murder charges as well. This is no longer just a civil dispute over assets. This is a criminal investigation. But we need to play this exactly right. If we move too fast, they will vanish. If we reveal what we know before the evidence is ironclad, they will disappear into some non-extradition jurisdiction with the $3 million. We need to keep this quiet for another 48 hours while Mike finishes tracking the final offshore routing numbers. After that, we strike with the full weight of the law. I nodded, feeling a cold stone of certainty settle in my stomach. 48 hours. I could do that. I would go back to the hospital. I would sit by Catherine's side. I would look at the nurses and the doctors and the hospital administrators, and I would play the part of the distraught husband perfectly. I would text Melissa back if she reached out. I would play the broken man. I would let her continue to believe that her path to total victory was clear and unobstructed. But every hour of the next 2 days would be a calculated maneuver. I was a man who had built skyscrapers from the earth up, and I knew that a building with a weak, compromised core is destined for a catastrophic fall. Their core was built on greed and lies, and I was going to watch it collapse while they were still inside it. I stood up and walked to the window of the conference room. Outside, the hospital grounds were bustling with life. People coming and going, people worrying about minor issues, people living lives that were simple and honest. My life had been irrevocably altered. I was no longer the man who had walked through the lobby with a hopeful heart 8 days ago. That man had died in the billing office when the clerk told me the account was drained. The man standing here now was a creature of a different sort, tempered by the fire of betrayal and sharpened by the cold steel of reality. I turned back to Benjamin and Mike. "Do whatever you have to do," I commanded. "Do not leave a single stone unturned. I want every single transaction documented. I want every forged signature identified and verified by experts. I want the names of those predatory lenders exposed. If there is a legal route to ensure they spend the rest of their lives behind bars, I want it found." Benjamin nodded his approval. "We have the team, Thomas. We have the resources. Just stay the course. We will be in contact within the hour with the next phase of the strategy." I left the conference room and walked back to the surgical wing. As I moved through the halls, I realized that I was now operating as a ghost. I was present, but entirely disconnected from the surface-level reality of the hospital. I was watching everything through a lens of suspicion and tactical necessity. I arrived back at Catherine's room and sat in the chair. Her condition was slightly improved, but she remained unconscious, her heart beating with the help of the new device. I held her hand and felt a strange calm. I was going to save her. I was going to preserve the life we had built together, and I was going to ensure that the people who tried to destroy it would face a ruin far more profound than any financial loss they could ever imagine. I was the silent watcher, and I was ready to bring the storm down upon my daughter's head. They had wanted me to disappear from their family forever. They were about to get exactly what they asked for, but in a way that would shatter their world into pieces from which they would never recover. The truth would be their end. The following morning, the heavy mahogany door of the hospital administrative conference room closed behind me with a solid, reassuring thud. Benjamin Hayes and Mike Rossi were already seated at the polished table surrounded by an even larger mountain of paperwork than the day before. The dark circles under Mike's eyes were deeper, indicating he had not slept a single minute. He had spent the entire night tearing through international banking firewalls and cross-referencing offshore real estate registries. I sat down in my usual chair, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I thought I had already heard the absolute worst. I believed the fraudulent $3 million mortgage and the squalid nursing home plot were the absolute depths of my daughter's depravity. I was terribly wrong. Thomas Mike began, his voice rougher and lower than usual. "I need you to brace yourself. The financial theft and the property fraud were just the mechanisms. We finally found the motive. We found out exactly what Derek and Melissa are doing in the United Arab Emirates, and why they suddenly left in such a chaotic rush. He slid a glossy high-resolution printout across the table. It was a digital rendering of an ultra-luxury high-rise building featuring massive glass balconies and infinity pools looking out over the Dubai skyline. I stared at the image, uncomprehending. "Are they investing in this development?" I asked, my voice flat. "No," Mike replied sharply. "They are not investing. They are buying. Specifically, they are purchasing the primary penthouse suite on the top floor of that tower. The purchase price is exactly $4 million. They are buying it outright in cash. Dubai is a known tax haven, Thomas. It has zero extradition treaties for these specific types of domestic financial crimes. Derek knows that the moment those fraudulent loans default and the banks come looking for their money, he will be facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Their plan was never to return to Chicago. They drained your $500,000 emergency fund to cover their immediate travel costs and their extravagant lifestyle while they waited for the real estate transaction to close. They took out the $3 million loan against your family estate to cover the bulk of the penthouse purchase price. They were actively transferring their entire lives to the Middle East, where they could live like absolute royalty, completely untouched by American laws. I processed the staggering scale of their exit strategy. "But the math does not make sense," I countered, looking between the two men. "The emergency fund was $500,000. The fraudulent loan was $3 million. That is $3.5 million total. If the penthouse costs $4 million plus the exorbitant closing fees and their current lavish spending spree, they are significantly short of the required capital. Where were they planning to get the rest of the money?" Benjamin let out a heavy, ragged sigh and removed his wire-rimmed glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked physically ill. "That is the final piece of the puzzle, Thomas. That is the exact reason we called you down here this morning." Mike intercepted communications between Derek and the Dubai property developers. The developers are notoriously strict with international buyers. They gave Derek and Melissa an absolute non-negotiable deadline. They required full verified proof of funds and the final cash transfer by the 15th of this month. If they miss that deadline, they lose the property and their entire initial deposit. I glanced at the calendar application on my cellular phone. Today was the 12th. The deadline was exactly 3 days away. "I still do not understand," I said, my heart beginning to pound with a slow, terrifying dread. Where were they getting the remaining money before the 15th? Benjamin leaned forward, his eyes filled with a profound, sickening sorrow. "Thomas, think about your comprehensive estate planning. Think about the insurance policies we updated 5 years ago when Catherine first retired." My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to spin out of control. "Catherine life insurance policy." I whispered the words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "Exactly," Benjamin confirmed grimly. "Catherine has a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy worth $1.2 million. Because of the temporary power of attorney Melissa forced you to sign, she legally positioned herself to manage the immediate distribution of those funds upon Catherine passing." The pieces of the monstrous puzzle violently slammed together in my mind, creating a picture of such pure, unadulterated evil that it defied all rational human logic. The fraudulent loans, the drained bank accounts, the sudden flight to Dubai, the non-negotiable real estate deadline on the 15th. And finally, the malicious medical directive, the do not resuscitate order. I choked out, my voice trembling violently. "Withdrawing the life support medications." Benjamin nodded slowly, his face pale and grim. "Melissa did not submit those medical directives out of some twisted sense of mercy, Thomas. She submitted them because she was looking at a calendar. She needed the remaining capital to close on the luxury penthouse. She needed the $1.2 million life insurance payout. And to obtain that massive payout, she desperately needed her mother to die. She needed her mother to die before the 15th of the month. She walked into this hospital, looked at the woman who gave her life, and decided to pull the plug simply to meet a real estate deadline. She orchestrated the murder of your wife to fund her tax-free escape. The absolute horror of the revelation hit me with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The air was entirely sucked out of my burning lungs. I grasped the edges of the heavy conference table, my knuckles turning stark white as I fought desperately for oxygen. A strangled, agonizing sob ripped its way up my raw throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I could not stop the sudden, violent torrent of tears. I wept. I wept for the innocent little girl I used to hold safely in my arms. I wept for the decades of unconditional love and personal sacrifice Catherine and I had poured into a child who had unfortunately grown into a cold-blooded, sociopathic killer. I wept for my beloved wife fighting for every single breath in the surgical unit, completely unaware that the daughter she cherished had actively signed her death warrant just to secure a better view of the beautiful Persian Gulf. My body shook with the sheer magnitude of the unforgivable betrayal. I buried my face in my trembling hands, letting the raw, unedited grief completely consume my shattered soul. Benjamin and Mike sat in absolute silence, offering me the respectful space to mourn the complete destruction of my family. I cried until my chest physically ached, until there were simply no tears left to shed. And then, as quickly as the violent storm of sorrow had arrived, it abruptly and completely vanished. The weeping suddenly stopped. The shaking in my hands ceased. I lowered my hands slowly and looked forward. I was cold. I was terribly, completely, and utterly ready. The stark clinical reality of the hospital room became my command center over the next 48 hours. I did not leave the premises functioning on a potent cocktail of black coffee and adrenaline. The 15th of the month was rapidly approaching, hanging over my head like a guillotine blade. Yet while Melissa was frantically staring at her calendar in Dubai, waiting for the notification that her mother passed a genuine medical miracle was quietly unfolding in the cardiac recovery wing. The experimental ventricular assist device that Dr. Evans had implanted was functioning flawlessly. It was taking the immense crushing workload off her failing heart, allowing her severely damaged tissues to finally rest and begin the slow process of cellular repair. Her vital signs, which had been erratic and dangerously weak for weeks, began to stabilize into strong, steady rhythms. The pale, translucent pallor of her skin was gradually replaced by a healthy, warm flush of returning circulation. On the morning of the 14th, just one day before that murderous real estate deadline, the doctors successfully removed the heavy breathing tube. I sat beside her bed, holding her fragile hand, my heart pounding with an entirely different kind of anticipation. Her eyelids fluttered heavy with lingering sedatives and then slowly opened. Her beautiful eyes, clouded with confusion, but undeniably present, found my face. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice a dry, raspy shadow of its former self. I leaned in, pressing my lips to her knuckles, tears of profound relief sliding down my cheeks. "I am here, my love," I promised, my voice thick with emotion. "You are safe now. You are going to be completely fine." The next several hours were dedicated to allowing her mind to clear. The medical team monitored her cognitive responses, expressing absolute amazement at her rapid neurological recovery. By late afternoon, she was sitting up slightly, sipping ice water and asking lucid questions about her prolonged hospitalization. I knew I had to tell her the truth. I could not allow her to remain vulnerable, nor could I execute the final phase of my trap without her explicit consent and understanding. I asked the nurses for complete privacy and locked the heavy wooden door of her recovery suite. I sat on the edge of her mattress, taking both of her hands in mine. I started from the beginning, speaking with slow, deliberate gentleness. I told her about the day I went to pay the medical bills and discovered the empty emergency fund. I told her about the forged signatures, the massive commercial loan taken against our family estate, and the sprawling network of international shell companies Derek had utilized to hide our wealth. Catherine listened in stunned silence, her grip on my hands tightening with every horrific detail. But the absolute hardest part was telling her about the medical directive. I watched the devastating realization wash over her features as I explained that our own daughter had legally ordered the doctors to let her die, all to secure a life insurance payout before a real estate deadline in Dubai. The profound heartbreak that shattered her eyes was the most painful thing I have ever witnessed. For a long, agonizing moment, Catherine simply wept, mourning the absolute death of the child we thought we had raised. I held her close, letting her cry against my shoulder, whispering quiet words of comfort. But Catherine has always been a woman of immense quiet strength. When she finally pulled away, the sorrow in her eyes had hardened into a brilliant, terrifying clarity. Her jaw set with the same fierce determination I had seen when we built our business together, from nothing. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady and completely devoid of fear. "We destroy them," I answered simply. "We take everything away from them." I brought Benjamin Hayes and Mike Rossi into the hospital suite to brief Catherine on the tactical specifics. Seeing her awake and lucid brought a rare, genuine smile to his usually stony face. Together, the four of us finalized the architecture of the ambush. With Catherine fully conscious and legally competent, Benjamin immediately drafted sworn affidavits detailing the explicit forgery of her signature on the commercial loan documents. This was the critical leverage we needed to escalate the situation from a civil dispute directly into a massive criminal indictment. I did not stop there. I authorized Mike to contact his former colleagues at the federal level. Within 2 hours, 2 senior detectives from the Financial Fraud Division of the State Police arrived at the hospital, accompanied by an assistant district attorney. They reviewed the towering mountain of forensic evidence Mike had compiled: the wire transfers, the fake notary stamps, the communications with the Dubai developers, and the undeniable timeline linking the Do Not Resuscitate order to the penthouse purchase deadline. The lead detective, a sharp, observant woman named Miller, was visibly appalled by the sheer calculating malice of the crimes. She assured us that they had enough probable cause to execute immediate multiple felony arrest warrants for both Melissa and Derek the absolute second they stepped foot on American soil. The trap was fully constructed, loaded with federal charges, and armed with undeniable, irrefutable truth. The only remaining task was to lure the predators back to the cage. It was the evening of the 14th. Dubai was 9 hours ahead, meaning it was already the early hours of the 15th. The deadline was imminent. She would be waiting in frantic desperation for the news of her mother passing. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the cold glass heavy in my palm. The tactical detachment I had cultivated over the past week was absolute. I was no longer a father texting his child. I was an executioner signaling the sudden drop. I opened the messaging application and slowly typed out the final lethal lie. The words flowed easily, meticulously designed to trigger her immediate return. "Melissa, please board the next available flight home. The doctors have informed me that her bodily systems are completely shutting down. The end is here. It is time to say goodbye. I will not authorize any extraordinary measures, just as you suggested. Please hurry." I pressed send and watched the message fly across the globe. I knew exactly how she would react. She would read those words and feel a surge of euphoric, sickening triumph. She would believe she had successfully run out the clock, securing her massive inheritance and her luxury penthouse at the exact moment she needed it. She would eagerly book first-class tickets back to Chicago, fully preparing to play the role of the devastated, grieving daughter for the hospital staff and the funeral attendees. She would expect to find a dead mother and a shattered, easily manipulated father. I set the phone down on the small table beside the hospital bed. My wife reached out, resting her warm, living hand over mine. We sat together in the quiet sanctuary of the recovery room, a united, unbreakable front. We had built our family legacy through decades of honesty and relentless hard work, and we would not allow it to be stolen by a pair of arrogant, murderous thieves. The game of deception was officially over. We were waiting for the flight to land. The flight from Dubai to Chicago took exactly 14 hours and 20 minutes. I knew this because Mike Rossi had tapped into the airline passenger manifests the moment Melissa and Derek scanned their first-class boarding passes at the international terminal. I sat in the quiet corner of Catherine Recovery Room, watching a specialized tracking application on a secure tablet Mike had provided. A small blinking red dot represented the commercial airliner as it crossed oceans and continents, carrying the two people who had conspired to murder my wife. Catherine was resting peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. The color had fully returned to her cheeks, and the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Benjamin Hayes and Detective Miller were stationed in an adjacent administrative office waiting for my signal. The trap was set with absolute precision. When the red dot finally touched down at O'Hare International Airport, I felt a cold surge of adrenaline wash over my entire body. I put the tablet away and stood up, smoothing my clothes. I had spent the last 2 days carefully cultivating the physical appearance of a completely broken man. I deliberately wore a rumpled shirt, skipped shaving up to let a rough stubble grow across my jaw, and practiced a stooped posture. I needed them to believe the illusion until the very last possible second. Mike sent a text message confirming their private car service had pulled up to the main hospital entrance. The vultures had officially arrived. Through a secure link to the hospital internal security cameras, which Mike had temporarily gained access to, with his federal credentials, I watched the performance begin. Melissa and Derek stepped out of a sleek, black luxury sedan, looking like they had just walked off the set of a high-fashion funeral photoshoot. They were dressed in impeccable coordinated morning attire. Melissa wore a tailored black designer dress that probably cost more than a standard hospital bed, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She applied waterproof mascara to ensure her fake tears would not ruin her presentation. Derek walked beside her in a sharp charcoal suit, looking grave and deeply serious, holding a heavy leather briefcase that I knew contained the fraudulent paperwork they intended to force me to sign. I watched them move through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby and approach the reception desk. Melissa immediately buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with beautifully choreographed sobs. Derek wrapped a supportive arm around her waist, leaning in to speak softly to the receptionist. I could almost hear the tragic narrative he was spinning about, rushing back from a critical international business trip to be by his dying mother-in-law's side. The receptionist, clearly moved by their display of profound sorrow, quickly directed them toward the cardiac intensive care wing. They walked toward the elevators, clinging to each other, playing the roles of the devastated family members with nauseating perfection. Nurses and doctors offered them sympathetic glances, completely unaware they were looking at ruthless predators. As they stepped into the elevator and the stainless steel doors slid shut, their entire demeanor instantly transformed. The security camera inside the elevator car captured the sudden chilling shift. Melissa dropped her hands from her face, revealing dry, calculating eyes. The trembling in her shoulders vanished completely, replaced by a rigid, impatient posture. She turned to Derek and began speaking in rapid, urgent whispers. I had Mike patch the audio feed directly into my earpiece. The sound of their voices, cold and dripping with greed, echoed directly into my ear. How quickly can we get the death certificate issued? She demanded, her tone entirely devoid of any human emotion. The Dubai developers are demanding the wire transfer by tomorrow afternoon. If we do not have the life insurance payout cleared by the morning, we are going to lose the penthouse deposit. Derek checked his expensive gold watch and offered her a smug, reassuring smile. Do not worry about the timeline, he replied smoothly. The medical directive you filed is ironclad. If she is not already gone, the doctors will have to pull the support systems the moment we confirm your proxy status. As for your father, he will be a total mess. I have the listing agreement for the estate right here in my briefcase. I will tell him that the medical bills are insurmountable and that we need to sell the house immediately to cover the debts. He will sign anything we put in front of his face right now. Melissa let out a soft, cruel laugh. And the nursing facility, she asked. Is the bed still reserved? Derek nodded, tapping his briefcase. Everything is ready. We will move him into Sunny Haven by the weekend. We can process the estate sale from the penthouse in Dubai while he rots in that state-funded dump. It is the perfect clean break. I stood in the center of Catherine recovery room, listening to the sheer, unadulterated evil spilling from my daughter's mouth. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation, any microscopic fragment of hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, was permanently incinerated. They were casually discussing the disposal of my life and the profitable timing of my wife's death, as if they were trading commodities on a stock exchange floor. They possessed absolutely no souls. I looked down at Catherine, who was watching me with wide, clear eyes. She had heard the audio feed through a secondary earpiece Mike had provided for her. Her expression was a mask of cold, hard steel. She nodded at me once, a silent confirmation that we were doing the exact right thing. The elevator doors chimed on our floor. I moved toward the door of our suite, leaving it open just a tiny crack. Through the narrow gap, I watched them walk down the long, brightly lit hospital corridor. They had instantly resumed their tragic performance. Melissa pulled a lace handkerchief from her designer purse, dabbing at the corners of her eyes, while Derek guided her forward with a look of stoic, masculine sorrow. They passed the nurse's station, receiving a final round of pitiful looks from the medical staff. Every step they took toward our door was a step deeper into the unavoidable trap we had built. They reached the heavy wooden door of Catherine's suite and paused. I watched through the crack as they took one final moment to prepare themselves. Melissa took a deep, dramatic breath, forcefully contorting her face into a mask of pure, devastating agony. Derek adjusted his tie and adopted a look of profound, respectful mourning. They expected to enter a dark, silent room. They expected to find a flatlining monitor, a lifeless body, and an old, broken man weeping in the corner, ready to hand over his entire fortune. Derek grasped the silver handle of the heavy wooden door. He pushed it open slowly, stepping into the bright room, leading his supposedly devastated wife by the hand. Derek pushed the heavy wooden door open with agonizing slowness, leading his supposedly devastated wife by the hand into the brightly lit recovery room. They stepped across the threshold, with their heads bowed, in synchronized theatrical sorrow. Melissa clutched her lace handkerchief against her mouth, letting out a sharp, trembling gasp, designed perfectly to solicit sympathy from anyone watching. Derek wrapped both arms around her shaking shoulders, pulling her against his tailored suit, playing the ultimate role of the protective, grieving husband, holding his fragile wife together in her darkest hour. They kept their eyes cast downward for a long, heavy moment, waiting for the sound of my broken sobbing, waiting for the tragic atmosphere to envelop them completely. Instead, they were met with an absolute deafening silence. There was no rhythmic beeping from a heart monitor. There was no mechanical hiss of a ventilator. There was no sound of a grieving widow. Melissa slowly lowered her handkerchief and looked toward the center of the room. The hospital bed was perfectly made, completely flat, and entirely empty. The meticulously crafted mask of devastation on her face instantly shattered, replaced by profound, genuine confusion. Derek stiffened his eyes, darting around the sterile walls, desperately trying to process the missing medical equipment. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat as his gaze fell upon the far corner of the expansive suite. Sitting near the large window, bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight, was Catherine. She was not lying on a slab in the morgue, nor was she suffocating without life support. She was sitting upright in a padded medical wheelchair, a warm blanket draped over her lap, calmly sipping a cup of chamomile tea. She looked pale, but her eyes were sharp, bright, and burning with a terrifying, unyielding fury. Beside her, I sat completely relaxed on a leather sofa, my posture rigid and commanding. Standing behind me, forming an impenetrable human wall of absolute authority, were Benjamin Hayes, Mike Rossi, Detective Miller, and her heavily armed partner from the Financial Crimes Division. The air in the room instantly plummeted to freezing. Melissa froze entirely. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped to her sides, the lace handkerchief fluttering uselessly to the linoleum floor. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, unable to form a single coherent syllable. The fake tears that had pooled in the corners of her eyes vanished, replaced by a wide, staring terror that practically radiated from her rigid body. Derek took a sudden, involuntary step backward, instinctively recognizing the lethal danger standing in front of him. His polished corporate arrogance melted away in an instant, leaving behind the cowardly, panicked posture of a trapped animal. He looked at the two police detectives, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and the heavy leather briefcase slipped slightly in his sweaty grip. He knew exactly who Mike Rossi was, and he knew exactly what Benjamin Hayes represented. The luxurious, tax-free fantasy life they had spent months carefully building in the United Arab Emirates was evaporating right in front of their eyes, replaced by the grim, inescapable reality of concrete cells and federal indictments. I stood up slowly from the leather sofa, buttoning my suit jacket, with deliberate, agonizing calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke in a tone so low and deadly that it made the air in the room vibrate. "You are incredibly early, Melissa." I noted my words cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Did you truly believe she would expire the exact second you snapped your fingers from a penthouse in Dubai? Did you assume the medical staff would simply turn off the machines and pack her away without a fight? Melissa stared at me, her chest heaving desperately, trying to rapidly calculate a new lie. "Dad," she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy squeak. We rushed back. "The text message you sent said it was over. We thought she was gone. We were so terrified." Catherine slowly lowered her teacup to the small table beside her wheelchair, the porcelain clinking sharply against the metal tray. "Do not insult my intelligence," Catherine commanded, her voice weak but laced with pure venom. "You were not terrified, Melissa. You were impatient. You were watching a clock, counting the minutes until you could collect a massive payout." I walked over to the large conference table where Benjamin had meticulously organized the towering stacks of forensic evidence. I picked up a thick stack of stapled papers, feeling the heavy weight of their deception in my hands. I turned back to my daughter and her husband, my eyes locked directly onto theirs. "I warned you once that you underestimated exactly who raised you," I said, taking a slow step toward them. "I told you that my money meant nothing to me if I could not protect my family. But you thought you were smarter. You thought you could bleed me dry and throw me away." I raised the thick stack of papers and threw them violently. They scattered across the floor, landing directly at Derek's polished Italian leather shoes. "Let us start with the $3 million high-interest commercial loan you fraudulently secured against my family estate," I stated coldly. I pointed to the papers littering the ground. "We have the forged signatures. We have the fake notary stamps from your corrupt little advisory firm. We have the wire transfers routing that exact amount directly into untraceable offshore accounts." Derek's face drained of all color, matching the stark white walls of the hospital suite. Next, I picked up a glossy real estate brochure and tossed it through the air, letting it flutter down onto the pile. "That is the $4 million luxury penthouse suite in Dubai. We know the developers demanded proof of funds by the 15th of the month. We know you needed your mother dead by tomorrow to collect her $1.2 million life insurance policy to cover the final closing costs." Melissa let out a sudden high-pitched whimper, pressing her hands against her mouth as the absolute reality of her situation finally set in. "But the true masterpiece of your cruelty is right here," I said, picking up a final single laminated page. I threw the Sunny Haven assisted living brochure directly at Melissa. It struck her chest and fell to the floor. "You planned to lock me in a squalid state-funded prison. You intended to strip away my dignity, label me mentally incompetent, and leave me to rot in poverty while you lived like royalty on the other side of the world." Detective Miller stepped forward, her hand resting casually on her service belt, her eyes unyielding. "Melissa Lawson and Derek Lawson," she announced, her voice echoing with the full weight of the law. You are both under arrest for wire fraud, grand theft forgery, and financial elder abuse. Furthermore, given the explicit connections between the real estate timeline and the unauthorized medical directive, the district attorney is actively pursuing 2 counts of attempted murder. The trap we had carefully built finally closed completely. I watched the color completely drain from Melissa's pale face as Detective Miller's words echoed in the quiet hospital room. She looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, but I slowly raised my hand to stop whatever fabricated excuse was about to spill from her mouth. You are officially entirely disinherited, I told her, my voice echoing with a hollow finality. Benjamin and I spent the last 48 hours restructuring the entire estate. Every single cent of the wealth your mother and I built has been permanently locked into an irrevocable trust. You will never see a single dime of it. Furthermore, we have already notified the bank and the federal authorities about the commercial loan fraud. The predatory lenders you used to mortgage our family home have been shut down and their assets frozen. You do not have the $3 million. You do not have the $1.2 million life insurance payout because your mother is sitting right here very much alive. The millions you owe the Dubai developers are entirely your problem now. You have absolutely nothing left. Derek let out a pathetic whimpering sound and took another step backward until his shoulders hit the heavy wooden door. The second detective moved with swift, practiced efficiency. He grabbed Derek by the arm, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the doorframe. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the room sounded like the ultimate gavel strike of justice. Derek began to blabber uncontrollably, offering to turn state evidence, offering to testify against his own wife if they would just let him go. He begged them to understand that it was all Melissa's idea, that she was the one who pushed for the medical directive and forged the documents. Detective Miller ignored his cowardly pleas entirely. She stepped directly in front of my daughter, pulling a second pair of handcuffs from her belt. Melissa Lawson, you are under arrest for severe elder abuse, grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, she stated, her voice ringing with absolute authority. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it, because your husband is already trying to sell you out to save his own skin. Turn around and put your hands behind your back immediately. Melissa did not turn around. She stood frozen, staring at the cold steel handcuffs dangling from the detective grip. I could see the terrifying reality violently crashing down upon her fragile psychological architecture. The magnificent delusion she had constructed was collapsing in real time. She was suddenly realizing that the luxurious penthouse in the United Arab Emirates was gone forever. She was realizing that she was millions of dollars in debt to ruthless international property developers who would not simply let her walk away from a broken contract. She was realizing that she was not returning to a life of fabulous wealth, but rather facing a very long and brutal sentence in a federal penitentiary. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. A rapid, panicked, wheezing sound escaped her pale lips as she began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The crushing weight of her own monstrous greed finally shattered her mind. Her eyes rolled completely back into her head, showing only the stark white sclera. Her knees buckled instantly, and she collapsed straight down, fainting dead away onto the cold, hard linoleum floor of the hospital suite. I did not blink once. I did not even flinch. I simply stood there and stared down at the unconscious body of the woman who had tried to discard me like worthless garbage. The detectives did not hesitate. They hauled a sobbing Derek out of the room, dragging him down the hallway as he continued to scream pathetic apologies. Detective Miller signaled for medical personnel to attend to Melissa, ensuring she would wake up in police custody, securely handcuffed to a hospital bed. I slowly turned my back on the pathetic scene on the floor and walked over to my wife. I knelt gently beside her wheelchair, taking her warm, living hands in mine. Catherine looked at me, her eyes shining with a profound mixture of lingering sorrow and immense unyielding strength. The storm had finally passed. The toxic infection that had plagued our family was completely removed. We were battered and we had lost a daughter to the darkness of her own avarice, but we had survived. We still had each other, and we had the remainder of our lives to live in absolute peace. I kissed her knuckles deeply, grateful for every single breath she took. Together we stepped over our daughter and slowly walked out into the bright light. There is a profound difference between family by blood and family by loyalty. As a father, I spent my entire life building a fortress of financial security to protect my child, only to realize I had inadvertently armed the very enemy who would try to destroy us. True wealth isn't found in bank accounts or luxury real estate. It is measured by integrity, empathy, and the character of the people standing by your bedside when you are at your weakest. Never allow blind parental love to excuse toxic behavior. Forgiveness is a virtue, but protecting your dignity is an absolute necessity. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? How did you find the strength to fight back? Share your story in the comments below. If Thomas's fight for justice resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories of truth and redemption.